Gentle and ladiesmen, welcome to the third installment of my in-depth analysis of The Last of Us. This time around we're actually gonna start the discussion. And we'll begin by taking a look at the story as a whole. The discussion will assume that you are familiar with the story either through watching my recap or playing the game yourself. So if you haven't, well, get familiar, otherwise you'll be spoiled to hell. So let's get cracking, shall we? Now, for all the things that the story does right, it actually has a few points that I'm not too fond of, to be honest. So I figure we'll start by discussing them, then we'll transition over to what the story does right, and then we'll talk about the ending, which we will go into great detail on in the next video. But starting out with, well, the less than good stuff. I think the game has some problems establishing what rules actually goes for the infection itself. For example, we're never given any idea of roughly how many spores you need to inhale before you're infected. Throughout the game you find several areas that are just packed with spores. These are the areas where Joel puts on his gas mask, so it's to be assumed that if you breathe more than one breath in this area, you would probably become infected. However, these seems to be the only areas where the spores are actually considered a threat. You don't have to go far from them before Joel removes his mask, indicating that he's no longer in danger of inhaling the spores. It would, however, be logical to assume that he's probably carrying a lot of spores with him, on his clothes, in his hair, on his backpack, but this doesn't seem to be a problem whenever he leaves a spore zone. This could probably be explained away by saying that, well, that just wasn't enough spores to infect him. However, the newspaper that Sarah can find during the prologue claims that the infection started after people ate contaminated crops. This, I feel, would indicate that it doesn't take that many spores to actually get you infected. Moreover, since the spores are airbound, it doesn't really make sense that they start becoming a threat as soon as you enter one of these, well, spore zones. It would probably also mean that there are plenty of spores in the air before you see the actual yellow cloud. Because if you're like me and you're from the countryside and you're also allergic to pollen, you know damn well that it doesn't take a big yellow cloud for you to start feeling the symptoms. Then there are scenes like this. Here we see Joel interacting with a corpse that's on its way to become one of the fruiting bodies that the fungus will then use to spread even more spores. However, this scene is just flat out weird. Not only is Joel touching her with his bare hands, but we also see loads of spores being released, both when he's moving her and when he's trying to force the door open. However, even if this seems like a pretty substantial amount of spores, it doesn't seem to affect Joel in any way. And all of this would have been fine if it hadn't been for the fact that the prologue establishes that ingesting a fairly small amount of spores can lead to an infection. Again, it's the inconsistency that gets me. We're never quite sure how big a threat the spores actually are, which is problematic as they're more or less presented as the major threat throughout the game. It's also never properly explained why a bite would be infectious. It's possible that the fluids from the infected are now all carrying the fungus. However, at several times we see characters get covered in infected blood and it doesn't seem to affect them one bit. It could also have something to do with the mutation being released directly into the bloodstream, but it's still a little foggy. It feels like they're working out of standard zombie logic here, but they haven't really established why this works. It's not like this fuzziness regarding the infection bothers me all that much, but I kept finding myself thinking, but what about the spores here? But why did the bite do this and this and that? Minor complaint perhaps, but I found myself a bit confused by it. Another thing I found myself raising an eyebrow at was Joel's change of attitude during the Wyoming chapter. After saying what is probably the harshest thing he says to Ellie throughout the entire story.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways.
He does a full 180 on it without even giving a proper explanation as to why he changed his mind. I mean, yeah, he says he's scared of Tommy's wife, but that sounds more like a sarcastic excuse than anything else. And I guess we do see him pondering it a bit on the way back to the camp. But even with all this, the shift is a bit jarring. I found this especially when I tried to summarize the story. It could be argued though, and incidentally I will argue the fact, that this actually plays into Joel's character pretty well. Still, I feel that they could have given this some more time and fleshed it out just a bit more, because as it is now, again, the shift is it's a bit sudden and it drastically changes the tone of the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Does it ruin the story as a whole or Joel as a character? No, of course not. It's just that it's a bit sudden and it gave me pause, to say the least. Perhaps the most glaring issues though is when the story and the gameplay seem at odds with each other. I'm thinking of two instances in particular. The first is when Joel hands Ellie the rifle, and the second one is when they encounter the sniper. During the section where Ellie gets handed the rifle, Joel tells Ellie to cover him should he get into trouble as he tries to take out a band of hunters. The problem is that there is no way to take out the hunters without being detected. If you manage to, they'll just spawn more until you're detected and Ellie gets to take a shot. This then triggers the cutscene where Joel says that she did a good job. This honestly pissed me off quite badly. First off, I felt the game was telling me that I did something wrong by not being detected and giving Ellie the chance to take the shot. Moreover, at this point I was very immersed in the game and, well, that immersion was shattered, to say the least. Especially when you see someone spawn right out of thin air. How they thought this was a reasonable solution when Joel doesn't get detected is beyond me. Just add a cutscene where Joel tells Ellie that the coast is clear, a bandit sneaks up behind him, and she's forced to shoot him. Then you cue the regular cutscene. Hell, you can even have made it unstealthable. Just have Joel be discovered as he jumps down and you have to have a shootout. Honestly, to have enemies spawn indefinitely is probably the worst possible solution they could find to a problem they themselves created. The fact that gameplay doesn't necessarily play out the way that the subsequent cutscene assumes it did. The same thing goes for the episode with the sniper. This is where Joel, Ellie, Sam and Henry are ambushed by a sniper who has set up his nest at the end of an open street. The idea is that you're supposed to dodge his fire, sneak up behind him and take him out. Again, this is pivotal to the story as the next gameplay section is Joel sniping bandits and infected from this sniper nest. The problem here is that the game supposedly presents two viable options, either sneak around or take your chances and try to take out the sniper from the front. The problem is that the second option isn't really an option at all, because the sniper, as it turns out, is invisible. Even if you do find an opening to actually take a shot at him, you can't because there's nothing there to hit. So again, you're forced to take the route which subsequent events assume you did. And again, this seems so simple to fix. Just give the sniper some sort of armor, a helmet, something to make him bulletproof. But just removing him and not having him be there at all is just lazy. Again, these are things that are seemingly so easy to fix, and I really can't understand how they made it into the final version of the game. It's one of the few times where I've actually felt that the designers have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea how to adapt gameplay to narrative. It's not a deal breaker for the entire game, but I can easily say that these are the worst parts of it. It messes up both story and gameplay, and for a game of this caliber, I would almost go as far as to say that it's almost inexcusable. Thankfully they're quite brief, and there's only 2 of them, which means that you can pretty quickly move on to better stuff. The final thing I want to bring up on the negative side is something that might surprise a few people, and that will be the game's use of female characters. Hold on, you might say. This game has plenty of female characters with well-developed personalities and motivations. And then there is Ellie, who is not only a well-written female character, but a well-written teenage female character. What issues could you possibly have with this game and its portrayal of females? Well, I'll tell you. It has nothing to do with the game's portrayal of females. In fact, I think they're some of the most well-written female characters I've encountered in games lately. My problem is where they appear in the storyline. Obviously, this is excluding Ellie, who's pretty much present throughout the entire story. I'm talking about the 3 other main female characters, that being Marlene, Tess and Maria. My problem is that their functionality seems to be to frame the rest of the story. Because think a bit about where they appear. Tess is only present at the beginning before she's killed. Maria pretty much appears just before and after the action section of the Wyoming chapter. Out of the 3, she easily has the smallest part. And Marlene also only appears in the beginning and at the very end. While the other characters who bookend the story, I really feel that they have been more or less left out of the main plot. They have little to nothing to do with what happens to Joel and Ellie after they leave Boston and before they arrive in Salt Lake City. All the characters they run into during their trip, including the enemies, are all male. This gives me the feeling that these characters were supposed to have a bigger part. In fact, we know for a fact that Tess was supposed to have a bigger part, but the middle chapter of the story was changed to the point that there was really no room for them. And that I think is a real shame, because it's only when we start to really get a feel for them that they disappear in one way or another. If anything, I feel that I'm left wanting more of them, to see more of what they could accomplish in this world. That goes for Maria in particular, which is a shame, because she's the one who's easily the most underdeveloped. I mean, what do we really know about her? She runs the group, and she's married to Tommy. That's it. I want to know her backstory, what she's been through, how she came to lead these people, how they built this society that could possibly become the cradle for a new civilization. But we're left knowing jack about her, which is a shame because, as I said, she's pretty much the only new female character who gets introduced as the story progresses. Again, my problems have nothing to do with the way the women are presented or written in the game, quite the opposite. My problem is that they're underutilized given how interesting they actually are. But hey, I'll take what I can get. I'd rather have underutilized, well-written female characters than no female characters at all. I think that will do as far as complaining goes. Now let's get into the interesting bit, what the story does right. This is probably gonna be one of the most slimmed down parts I'm ever gonna make because there are so many things in this game that I want to compliment it on. I hope I'll be able to get to them all eventually, especially as I talk about the characters and the ending, but for now let's talk about the general things that the story gets really right. I think the best place to start is probably also the most obvious one, and that is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. This is what I would call a textbook example of a video game relationship that develops organically. If you compare the first scenes they spend together with the last scenes they spend together, the relationship between Joel and Ellie is like night and day. But to the game's credit, there is no single defining moment where they connect, where they click, where they start to understand each other. I mean, sure, there is the end of the winter chapter, which I suppose you could argue is the place where they finally truly bond. But think of what led up to that moment. You've had Ellie nursing Joel back to health after he's been damn near dead for a couple of weeks. And you have Joel doing, well, morally questionable things in order to find Ellie's location. I view their embrace as the culmination of a series of events where they have, through action, shown what they mean to each other. It's not necessarily the point where they realize that their bond is unbreakable, but rather the point where they realize that they can trust each other. That they can count on the other one to come and help them even if they're completely helpless. Aside from this, there really are no other truly defining moments except perhaps for the ending. You really do feel like you've watched these people grow. That you understand how they came to be so close to each other. And, perhaps most importantly, on a purely emotional level, you sort of understand Joel's reasoning as he carries Ellie out of the hospital. Time and time again we see games try and fail to convince us that two characters have an emotional connection. Therefore it's doubly refreshing to see a game that actually gets it right, and not just right, but very right. The story more or less relies on Joel and Ellie's relation, and if they had failed to get this right, then the story would have fallen on the first hurdle. Thankfully Naughty Dog pulls it off in grand fashion, turning what could have been the game's biggest obstacle into one of its core strengths. On a related note, one thing the game absolutely nails is giving key cutscenes an incredible amount of emotional weight. How they managed to do this, I don't know, but somehow they managed to handle scenes that could be considered cliché and turn them into grade A tearjerkers. Take Saras Death scene, for example. This kind of scene has been done time and time again in gaming, and rarely does it ever feel like it has a proper emotional impact. In fact, I feel that many times it has the opposite effect. One character dying in another one's arms, spouting lines that make them sound like they've been preparing this speech for weeks. Personally, I tend to find these scenes overly dramatic and at times even a little silly. This scene, on the other hand, is what all those other scenes wish they could be. As I was making my first video, I probably had to watch it, I don't know, 10-ish times. And still, even seeing it today, I still get a big lump in my throat. I think there are several factors that go into making this scene so effective. For starters, the music is absolutely brilliant. It conveys not only the hopelessness of the situation, but also Joel's desperation to save his daughter. Plus, it's just a good goddamn track in and of itself. Something I also think helps is the lack of words from Sarah. She doesn't say a single word, she just sobs and makes squeals of agony. This while Joel is desperately trying to tell her that everything is gonna be alright when they both know that it's not. And when she goes silent, we know immediately what has happened, making the tragedy of the situation even more impactful. Another thing that of course has to be brought up is the brilliant acting of Troy Baker, the man who does the voice and the motion capture for Joel. I really can't say enough good things about his performance in this scene. He just nails it. And I think that this is a great demonstration of why Naughty Dog's cutscene production process is so effective. For those of you unfamiliar with it, when creating a cutscene, Naughty Dog has the actors not only read the lines but also do the motion capture. As such, the actors can naturally adjust their voice and what they're saying to what the character is physically doing. It also means that they don't have to imagine, for example, holding someone, but that they can actually physically do it while acting. And I really feel that that comes across well in Saras' death scene, and pretty much in every cutscene in the entire game. With the exception of maybe one or two, every cutscene in the game hits the perfect emotional note. It really does help to draw you in, and if nothing else makes you feel more engaged in the story. It's a tone that many games strive for, but surprisingly few are able to pull off. But in The Last of Us, every cutscene leaves you either devastated, pondering, or anxious. It's one of few games that can tout itself as being emotional, and they pull it off right from the get-go. Something that's easily forgotten and should not be underestimated is what the game manages to do with a fairly generic setting. As fond as I am of the setting, it's undeniable that this has been done several times before. The world is overrun by infected, the government has collapsed, and now there is one person who is immune who will be the key to creating a vaccine. So now the fate of humanity rests upon this person getting to wherever this person needs to go. It's been done several times before, and it's in no way, shape or form original, but god damn it do The Last of Us manage to keep it fresh. I think one of the key factors to this, at least in my mind, is that the game has clearly separated humans from nature and other animals. Throughout the game, we time and time again see nature overrunning man-made structures, sending a signal that all it takes is negligence. After that, nature will reclaim what we consider to be ours. In fact, every time you head into the wilderness, you realize that it's more or less untouched by the infection. Furthermore, it doesn't seem to be affecting any other animals. One could be forgiven for thinking that the fungus is nature's way to fight back against the humans. That this is as far as we go evolution-wise. And that we, after generations of trying to bend nature's will, are becoming part of the ecosystem again, but this time in a forceful manner. This feeling that humanity is being erased slowly, almost passively, by the planet itself is something new. I don't think I've ever encountered anything, at least not on this scale, in another game. And it's with this overwhelming sense of slow but certain doom that the glimpses of hope feel all the more worthwhile. Joel and Ellie reaching Thomastown, the giraffes, even something as simple as a sunrise. They offer brief but necessary breathers from the general hopelessness of the situation. And I think that this is a big part as to why this game doesn't feel as generic as it probably should. Whereas many zombie stories seem content to leave the characters in hopeless situation after hopeless situation, The Last of Us offer glimpses of light, even if it's just enough to keep the characters going. I genuinely believe that these grains of positivity, along with the whole vengeful nature scenario, is what keeps the story fresh, despite it being part of what could only be described as the most oversaturated genre of this console generation. Standing out in a sea of millions, that takes something extra. The final thing that I want to bring up is how the game handles moral ambiguity. I'm gonna be making a full video on this later, so I'll try to keep it brief. But I do feel that it needs to be mentioned here, as it really is one of the core strengths of the story. Now, the game is riddled with situations where a character acts in a certain way believing that their actions are morally justifiable. However, if you stop to think about it just for a second, you realize that it might not be as clear-cut as it first seems. Some of them are quite obvious, like Joel deciding to torture people, Henry abandoning Joel while they're being pursued by the hunters, Tess murdering Robert, and so on and so on. In the heat of the moment, it's easy to proclaim these things as either right or wrong. But give it some contemplation and you realize that the people who would have acted differently probably have a point as well. There is also a much bigger question at hand. In a world where ethics seems to have gone the way of the dodo, should we even care about what's right or wrong? If acting morally either gets you killed or robbed, why should you even bother? Just look at the hunters, they seem to be living quite a decent life, but they don't give a damn about ethics. Why follow a moral code if all you have to show for it is a clean conscience when you get brutally murdered? Even characters we would classify as the good guys are, well, morally questionable to say the least. Joel, Ellie, Tess, Bill, Henry, at the very least they've all killed someone. Which, in a regular moral setting, would be hard to justify. Here it's all done in the name of survival, and in some cases getting to an end goal. That does, however, bring up the question of whether our heroes are so much different from the hunters. Sure, the hunters go about it a bit more brutally, but in the end they use the same moral justification for their actions, which I think makes for interesting discussions, to say the least. Anyhow, I'm gonna go more in depth on this in a later video, in which I'll also bring up individual cases and discuss them from different moral philosophical points of view. Given that this subject requires its own video, it'll give you an idea of roughly how many interesting moral dilemmas are actually presented throughout the story. I'm gonna wrap it up here, but I wanted to remind you that the things I brought up in this video are by no means the only things that the story does right. Things like pacing, characters, dialogue, stuff like that, it's all there front and center. I just wanted to highlight the things that I feel makes the story shine a bit brighter than the rest. Anyway, thank you for watching part 3 of the series. Next time around we'll be talking about something that I think is so good that it warrants its own video. The ending. As usual, if you have any comments or suggestions as to how to improve the quality of these videos, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And if you like what I'm doing, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Take care, and I hope to catch you later.